It was the scream that shattered my peaceful afternoon, the kind that cuts through the hum of bees, the rustle of corn stalks, and the quiet joy of harvest. "You're under arrest for illegal farming." That was the voice of Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA board, marching toward me with her ridiculous clipboard and two security guards who looked more confused than concerned. I was standing in the middle of my own field, ripe tomatoes glistening in the sun, okra pods swaying in the breeze, and a row of bell peppers I had just watered, all on my late grandmother's land, which had been passed down to me and sat just outside the city line. Karen was already pointing to a bright orange paper she had in her hand, her sunglasses slipping down her nose. "You're not zoned for agriculture. This is suburban land, and you're in violation of HOA Code 44B. That's unauthorized crop production within a non-farm housing development. I have already notified the authorities." Before I could say a word, a sheriff's patrol car rolled up the gravel path. My heart dropped, not out of fear, but disbelief. Was she really calling law enforcement over tomatoes? The sheriff stepped out, looked at me, then at Karen, then at the security guys. "Who here called this in?" he asked, one eyebrow raised. Karen stepped forward confidently. "I did. I'm the HOA president. This man is illegally farming in a neighborhood with strict landscaping regulations. He's turning this peaceful community into a vegetable market." I kept quiet for a second, letting her talk herself into deeper water. The sheriff walked up to me slowly and asked, "Sir, do you have identification?" I nodded. "Sure. In the truck. But before we go down that road, Sheriff, maybe it'll help if I tell you who I am." Karen rolled her eyes. "I already know who he is. He's Jake, the hippie who bought that house on inherited land and now thinks he's a farmer. Next thing you know, he'll have cows out here." But the sheriff had stopped listening to her and turned fully to me. "Wait. Jake Ellis?" he asked. "The state agriculture director?" Karen froze. "Yes," I replied calmly. And if she actually read the zoning code she loves to quote, she'd know that this land was designated agricultural heritage property back in 1971. "I'm just bringing it back to life." Karen's face drained of color as the sheriff turned back toward her. "We've got a problem," he said, pulling out his notepad, not for me, but for her. The sheriff turned slowly to Karen, voice cold as ice. "Ma'am. I need you to step back and explain why you tried to impersonate an officer and file a false report. 3 months earlier, I had been living in a downtown apartment in the city, tired of politics and the pressure of public life. I'd served for years in the state government, most recently as the state agriculture director, a job I loved but one that rarely gave me peace. When my grandmother passed away, I inherited her small home and a few acres of land in a town just outside the city. I saw it as a sign. I needed a break, a chance to reconnect with the soil, to live a simpler life. I had no idea that behind the rows of identical houses and overly trimmed bushes lay a battlefield ruled by a woman named Karen Thornton. The day I moved in, she showed up at my gate with a welcome packet that felt more like a rulebook for a dictatorship. No pink flowers. No unapproved fencing. No wind chimes louder than 3 decibels. No growing edible crops. I chuckled. No tomatoes? Karen didn't smile. Vegetables attract pests. And pests bring down property value. I ignored her. This land was outside the formal HOA boundary, she didn't know that yet. I spent my days digging, planting, and composting. I wasn't growing a commercial farm, just corn, tomatoes, spinach, peppers, and okra. Everything was legal. I even used organic methods. Neighbors began stopping by, asking questions, requesting seeds, complimenting the sweet smell of the soil. Kids waved when they saw me. Elderly folks smiled as they walked past with bags of tomatoes I'd shared freely. That made Karen furious. She started leaving violation notices on my fence. Then came complaints filed with the county zoning board, each one dismissed. Finally, she tried using her own private security team, hired through HOA dues, to intimidate me. But today she made a critical mistake. She called the police. And not just for a noise complaint or a citation, she told them I was illegally operating an unregistered farm and resisting HOA directives. What she didn't know. The sheriff's department had worked with me on agricultural land reform just last year. I'd been in dozens of meetings with their department. And her fake arrest notice? That was about to backfire in the worst way. But just when I thought it was over, Karen did something I never imagined. She picked up her walkie-talkie and whispered into it. Move in. Secure the crops. And suddenly, 5 more people in polo shirts and fake badges stormed my garden and began pulling up my plants. I screamed, HOA. That's state-protected heirloom produce. You better stop right now. But they didn't listen. One of them shouted, Karen said these are hazardous materials. We're confiscating everything for the HOA. I ran toward them, but it was already too late. They had ripped out the entire tomato bed, and were heading for my irrigation system next. The envelope landed in Cynthia's hand like a sack of bricks. She stared at the bold seal printed on the front, State of, Redacted, Office of Land Use and Agricultural Affairs. Her fingers trembled. Her pink lipstick curled into a nervous line. Her eyes darted between the men in suits and me, suddenly not the dirty farmer she had pegged me as, but someone who had just wrecked her world with one envelope. What is this? She stammered. The lead investigator stepped forward. He was a tall man with a clipboard and an aura of quiet authority. He didn't yell. He didn't smirk. He just read calmly from the paper. Cynthia Loretta Bridges, president of the Willow Creek Ridge HOA, you are being formally investigated for the following allegations. Illegal expansion of HOA jurisdiction. Forgery of land use notifications. Property harassment and sabotage. Impersonation of state officials. Unauthorized enforcement of zoning law. He paused. Oh, and destruction of state-protected agricultural specimens. That includes the heirloom tomatoes you had your crew rip out. Cynthia gasped, staggering back a step like she had been slapped. This is a misunderstanding, she shrieked. I was just doing my job. These people, she jabbed her finger toward me, are disturbing the peace. This is a neighborhood, not a jungle. The man didn't blink. Ma'am, you're being recorded under State Oversight Protocol 3.2. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. Just then, one of the HOA security officers, who had helped tear up my crops, still wearing his fake badge, walked over with a sheepish look. Ah. Mr. Director. I didn't know she wasn't allowed to do this. She told us we were deputized. I thought this was all legal. Cynthia spun on him. You idiot. Don't say a word. But it was too late. The state agents were already pulling out body cams and taking photos of the torn-up field. The citizen's arrest had just become a full-blown criminal investigation. Let me backtrack a bit. It all started when I opened a small, self-serve produce cart outside my ranch gate. It wasn't anything fancy, just a little table with baskets of okra, tomatoes, bell peppers, squash, and jars of honey from my bees. I set out a wooden box that read, "Take what you need. Leave what you can. God bless." It wasn't about making money, it was about giving back. My grandmother had raised me that way. But just days after putting it up, things started happening. The cart was knocked over at night. Vegetables were stomped into the dirt. Honey jars disappeared. Ranger barked at the darkness more than once. Then came the paper notes. Unlicensed stand. Remove immediately. HOA rule violation, no sales. This is not a farmer's market. I laughed at first. But then it got serious. One evening, I caught a man in a windbreaker trying to install a hidden camera near my water barrel. He ran off before I could reach him. That's when I knew. They were watching me. So, I decided to watch back. I installed motion sensors, trail cams, and even flew a drone over my property line to monitor traffic. I began documenting every act of sabotage. Every person who stepped onto my land. Every paper note. Every face. I stored it all, neatly catalogued, waiting for the right moment. But the final straw came the day I got a visit from an elderly neighbor, Miss Hattie, who lived 2 doors down. She brought me cookies. And tears. "I'm so sorry, son," she whispered. I overheard them. "They're trying to get your land condemned. They said if you won't follow HOA orders, they'll declare it a hazard." That night, I contacted my office. I had been quiet long enough. One of the investigators turned toward me. "Director Dean, do you have your full documentation ready?" I nodded and handed over a brown folder. "Everything's in there. Photos, videos, even voice recordings of Cynthia threatening to bulldoze the whole place and build tennis courts." Cynthia's face turned ghost white. "You bugged me," she screamed. "No," I replied. "You were shouting at the top of your lungs. My bees heard you." The investigator flipped through the folder, nodding. "This is more than enough to proceed with a full enforcement order." That's when Cynthia lost it. "I'm calling my lawyer," she screeched, pulling out her phone. But just as she did, her own HOA vice president, Todd, a quiet man who mostly nodded in meetings, stepped forward. He held out his own folder. "I'd like to submit this," he said, handing it to the agent. "It's a record of everything she did, against the board's vote." "What are you doing?" Cynthia screeched. Todd didn't even flinch. "Covering my behind. And helping the actual law do its job." The agents huddled. There was murmuring, nodding, a few glances exchanged. Finally, one turned to Cynthia. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you're being detained for questioning and will be escorted to the county office." "No, no, no, no," she muttered, stumbling backward. As they led her to the SUV, she turned one last time to look at me. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You think you're smart? You're just a dirt farmer." I smiled and tipped my hat. "No, ma'am. I'm the one who makes the rules you just broke." 2 days after Cynthia was escorted off my land and taken in for questioning, a strange stillness settled over the neighborhood. No more fake citations. No more stomping feet across the property line. No late-night sabotage. But I knew better. Silence like that wasn't peace, it was planning. And I was right. It started when I got an invitation slipped under my front door, no envelope, no return address. It was handwritten in tight cursive on floral stationery. "Mr. Dean, we, the remaining members of the Willow Creek Ridge HOA Board, cordially invite you to attend a special closed-door HOA meeting to resolve ongoing community conflicts. Your presence is strongly encouraged. The Interim Board President." I held the note in my hand, heart thumping with suspicion. A closed-door meeting. No agenda. No notice to the public. Ranger barked from the porch, like he could sense what I already knew. They weren't done with me. I walked to the meeting, and what I found inside the community hall left me speechless. They had created a giant poster board of my face in the middle of the room labeled, "Threat to the Neighborhood." You see, what many folks don't realize is that not all HOA members are created equal. Cynthia wasn't acting alone. She had help, an inner circle of board members who'd been quietly feeding off HOA power for years. Using fines and zoning threats to control landscaping, architecture, even porch furniture. They bullied the elderly. Forced families to repaint their homes. Find a mother of three $100 because her child's bike was visible from the sidewalk. And now that Cynthia was gone, they weren't planning to let me celebrate. They were rallying. Planning something worse. And this meeting? It wasn't about resolution. It was a trap. The community hall looked like a courtroom by the time I stepped in. Folded chairs in rows. A long folding table at the front, 3 men in cheap suits seated like judges. A slideshow projected behind them read. Unauthorized agricultural activity, what happens when we let one man break the rules? And there it was, my photo, zoomed in and plastered on every display board like I was a wanted criminal. Someone had even drawn a cartoon pitchfork in my hand. The interim president, Greg Sanders, stood and cleared his throat. Mr. Dean, we appreciate you joining us. As you can see, the board has gathered ample evidence to propose a vote for your forced removal from the Willow Creek Ridge community. I blinked. My removal? From land I own? Yes, he said smugly. For violation of community standards, failure to comply with aesthetic codes, and for bringing undue stress to the HOA system. I paused. Then I smiled. You do know I'm not part of your HOA, right? The room shifted uncomfortably. Greg's smile faltered. Well, technically, your land falls near the HOA buffer zone, not in the HOA, I interrupted, stepping closer. And not subject to your rules. Greg's cheeks flushed. We still have a right to defend the peace of our neighborhood. I raised my phone and hit play. It was a recording of Cynthia, clear as day, saying, Greg, don't worry about the zoning. Once we push him hard enough, he'll either give up or the fines will bury him. Gasps spread through the room like wildfire. I let the audio roll as Cynthia named every member of the inner circle, and every trick they planned to play. Greg's face went stiff. That's inadmissible, a woman stood up from the back row. Her name was Janelle. She had lived here for 20 years. That's enough, she said. We didn't move here to be ruled by power-hungry neighbors. This man grows food. He gives it away. And all you do is harass him. Others stood too. Heads nodded. A couple clapped. The tide was turning. But Greg wasn't done. He slammed his palm on the table. You people are forgetting something, he shouted. We control the road. The HOA controls Sweet Clover Lane, his only access. And the board just voted to restrict private access due to non-compliance. Effective immediately. I felt the punch in my chest. They couldn't control my land, but if they blocked the road, I'd be cut off from everything. Deliveries. Emergency services. My workers. My elderly neighbors who came for food. I locked eyes with him. You're going to blockade a public access road? Greg smirked. It was voted in. It's done. He pressed a button on his tablet. Within seconds, 2 pickup trucks rolled down the lane and parked sideways across the road, dragging metal fences behind them. I stepped out of the meeting and stared down the road I had driven my tractor on just that morning. It was now completely blocked. And a sign was being zip-tied to the fence, road closed, HOA violation enforcement zone. The ranger growled at my feet. And I said, oh, you just made the wrong move. I needed to cool off. To think. So I went back to the one place that always calmed my mind, Grandpa's barn. It had stood on this land for 80 years, its wooden planks weathered by sun and storm, but still strong. Inside was everything he ever used to keep the ranch running, old seed catalogs, rusty tools, a broken tractor, and that squeaky green rocking chair I used to sit in as a kid. But today, something caught my eye. Tucked beneath a loose floorboard was an old tin box. I crouched down and pulled it free. Dust flew everywhere. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were dozens of yellowed papers, handwritten letters, bank receipts, and one thick document with a faded red seal. It read, State of, redacted, Land Use Charter, Agricultural Sovereignty Designation, 1967. I froze. My hands trembled as I scanned the legal jargon. This wasn't just any zoning document. This was a state-certified charter, signed by the governor in 1967, that granted my grandfather's land perpetual agricultural autonomy from municipal encroachment, zoning override, or third-party enforcement interference. In plain English, no one, HOA or not, could ever touch this land. And if they tried, the state had the right to impose fines, revoke charter status from the HOA, and potentially dissolve the board. It was the ultimate trump card. And it had been sitting in my barn for over 50 years. The very next morning, I marched to the courthouse with that document in hand. The clerk's jaw dropped. Do you even understand what this means, Mr. Dean? I nodded. Yes. But I want it notarized, certified, and entered into public record. She did it all, fast. Within hours, I had 4 notarized copies, one stamped by the county land registrar. The next stop. The judge. Luckily, we had already filed for an emergency hearing against the HOA after the road blockade. And now? Now I was walking in armed to the teeth with legal TNT. The courtroom was packed. Cameras. Reporters. Angry residents. And at the defense table, Greg and the remaining board members, looking way too confident for people standing on a legal minefield. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Ellison, looked at me with curious eyes. Mr. Dean, you may present your opening. I stepped forward, placed the yellow document gently on the desk, and said, Your Honor, what you are holding is a legally binding state charter that has remained in effect for over 50 years. This land is exempt from all zoning enforcement, annexation, and external control, including HOAs. The blockade, the harassment, the destruction of crops, it's all in direct violation of state law. And now, I want accountability. The room went still. Greg leaned forward, squinting. That document is ancient. Irrelevant. Judge Ellison raised an eyebrow. Actually, Mr. Sanders. It's very relevant. In fact, I had a copy of this charter in my hands when I clerked for the Agriculture Commission 20 years ago. This is authentic. And binding. Greg's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The judge banged her gavel once. This court finds that the HOA acted outside its jurisdiction. All blockades must be removed within 24 hours. Furthermore, the court is opening an inquiry into financial abuse by the Willow Creek Ridge HOA board, starting with Mr. Greg Sanders. The crowd gasped. One woman stood up and clapped. Then another. Then the whole room burst into applause. But just when I thought it was done, a woman stood up from the back of the courtroom. She wore dark sunglasses, a scarf around her head, and a long coat. When she removed the scarf, I nearly choked. It was Cynthia. Free. Smiling. And she walked right up to the microphone. Your Honor, she said sweetly, I have something to confess. Everyone fell silent. I wasn't working alone. I was funded. The judge frowned. By who? She pointed. Straight at the mayor, sitting quietly in the back row. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Every eye turned toward the mayor, Harold Jennings, who had sat quietly in the back row the entire time, pretending to be just another bystander. But now that Cynthia had pointed straight at him, the pressure in the room shifted like a thunderstorm rolling in. Judge Ellison narrowed her eyes. Mayor Jennings. Do you have a response to this accusation? He stood slowly, adjusted his tie, and forced a weak smile. I'm not sure what Ms. Bridges is implying, Your Honor. My presence here is merely to observe. Cynthia smirked. Observe? Or cover your tracks. Her voice dropped low and venomous. Why don't you tell the court about the backroom deal? About how you approved our HOA expansion plans in exchange for a cut of the developer buyout once we forced Mr. Dean off his land. Gasps. Flashes from reporters' cameras. Greg Sanders tried to shrink in his seat. The judge slammed her gavel. Order. Ms. Bridges, do you have evidence of this claim? Cynthia pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. I made a backup, just in case I got thrown under the bus. She walked up and handed the phone directly to the court bailiff. It played a recording, grainy but clear. Mayor Jennings' voice said. Get him off the land. Bulldoze the crops. I've got the buyers lined up for the development. Half-acre lots, gated community. HOA gets a bonus, you get your re-election fund. My heart stopped. They weren't just trying to ruin me. They were trying to erase my land from the map. That night, I returned to the ranch thinking it was over. The court had ruled in my favor. The road was ordered to be cleared. The public was outraged. Cynthia had flipped. The mayor had been exposed. It should have been done. But as I drove up Sweet Clover Lane in the morning, the barricades were back. Only this time, they weren't from the HOA. They were construction crews, bulldozers, backhoes, flatbed trucks with stakes and wooden frames. And standing right in front, directing traffic, Mayor Jennings himself. He turned and smiled when he saw me. Morning, Director. You may have won the courtroom. But I just passed an emergency city order to begin road restructuring for community enhancement. This road is now condemned. He tossed a rolled-up paper toward my truck windshield. It was stamped with a city seal. Notice of seizure, imminent domain claim pending. I jumped out of the truck. You're stealing my land. Jennings smirked. Just the road. But once the road's gone, you won't have access. That makes your property legally inaccessible for public safety, and, poof, it goes into city hands. He leaned closer. Looks like your tomatoes won't save you this time. I looked behind him. A bulldozer was already reversing toward the dirt path, ready to dig it up. I felt rage. Real rage. But this time, I didn't yell. I dialed. One of the perks of my job as agriculture director. I had direct access to the State Environmental Protection Task Force. They didn't move quickly. But when did they? They hit like a freight train. Activate Emergency Agricultural Preservation Order 114, I told the agent on the phone. Immediate threat to designated sovereign farmland. Mayor overreach. Full state protection requested. The line went quiet for 2 seconds. Then, confirmed. Units are en route. I turned to the mayor and said calmly, you're about to be shut down. Permanently. He laughed. By whom? You and your scarecrow. Then, we heard the helicopter. 2 black SUVs came screeching up the road from the opposite direction. The bulldozer operator paused. So did the mayor. Then came the chop 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 of helicopter blades. The vehicle touched down on a flat patch just beyond the tree line. Uniformed officers stepped out. And not just any officers. State-level environmental and agricultural protection agents. They were in tactical vests. With clipboards. And arrest warrants. The lead officer walked right up to the mayor, presented a folder, and said, Mayor Jennings, you are under investigation for abuse of power, conspiracy to commit land fraud, and endangerment of protected agricultural zones. You are ordered to cease all activity immediately. This site is now under state lockdown. The bulldozer shut off. All the construction workers stepped back. The mayor? He tried to run. Didn't get far. They tackled him into a hay bale. The mayor was in handcuffs. face down in straw. And every camera in town was pointed right at him. The video went viral before I even made it back to the ranch. By nightfall, national news anchors were calling it the tomato takedown and when the scarecrow fought City Hall. But I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because I knew something still wasn't over. The HOA. The board. The land. There was one final hearing scheduled at the state capitol, and I had been summoned to testify. Not just about my land. Not just about the mayor. But about every corrupt HOA in the state that had crossed the line. And for the first time in my life, I had something stronger than titles or policies backing me up, the truth. The marble halls of the state capitol were nothing new to me. But this time, I wasn't there as a polished bureaucrat. I wore boots still caked with dirt. My sleeves were rolled up. And the scent of fresh okra clung to my flannel shirt. People stared. Some whispered. But when I walked into the main chamber, they stood up. State senators. Agriculture leaders. Small-town farmers. Even city folks who had been fined by their own HOAs for planting basil on their balconies. I wasn't just a speaker. I had become a symbol. The chairwoman of the committee banged her gavel. Director Dean, the floor is yours. I stepped up to the podium, cleared my throat, and said, "This isn't just about me. It's about every homeowner who's been bullied for planting a tree without permission. Every family is fined for having a vegetable garden. Every elder was forced to repaint their home because the HOA didn't like their flowers. This land was never about profit. It was about peace. About feeding people. And they tried to take that from me. From all of us." I pulled out a jar of honey and set it on the table. My bees don't ask for permits. They just make something sweet out of something wild. Maybe we should take a lesson from them. The room went silent. Then applause. The chairwoman leaned forward. "Mr. Dean, the committee has reviewed your documentation, the historical charter, and the actions of the HOA and city leadership. Effective immediately, your land is declared a state-protected agricultural heritage site. No agency, board, or city may interfere." She paused. "And as for the Willow Creek Ridge HOA, a motion has been filed to dissolve it permanently." 2 months later, the sun rose over my fields just like always. But everything had changed. The barricades were gone. The road had been repaved by the state. Kids from the local school came for field trips to learn about gardening. Miss Hattie brought fresh-baked cornbread every Saturday. And Cynthia? Well, she was working community service at the county co-op. Pulling weeds. Under my supervision. She grumbled every time I walked past. I just smiled and handed her a watering can. "Don't forget to love the soil," I said. I received one last letter, hand-delivered. It had no return address, but I recognized the handwriting. It read, "Mr. Dean, I still think you're a pain in the butt. But I also think you care more than most people I've ever met. And maybe, just maybe, we need more tomatoes and fewer rules. Respectfully. Cynthia Bridges." I folded it carefully and placed it in the barn next to my grandfather's old charter. Then I stepped outside, grabbed my hoe, and went back to work, planting, watering, and growing something the HOA never understood. Freedom.